Okay, we're good to go, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. The session you are attending is Building Re-Occupancy in British Columbia, the Risks and Solutions presentation. Can everyone still see my screen?
We're good.
Okay, good to go. So the session that we're talking about today is we're going to discuss from an environmental perspective how buildings have been reduced by reduced capacity during COVID. A couple of housekeeping items before we start. We have two functions in this program. There is a chat feature that's to be used if you have any technical difficulties. Our admin staff can help you out. If you're having audio or any visual issues, please use the chat function. And there's also a Q&A function. So if you guys have any questions during the presentation, please leave a message there and we'll address them at the end of the session. If for some reason there are a lot of questions and we don't get to them all, I'll leave my contact information at the end and we can connect directly if you have any specific questions or if there's anything maybe we ran out of time for. So looking forward to chatting with you all after this. Also, there are a few poll questions that we'll be asking throughout the presentation. Please participate. They're just general questions, not a test or anything. We wouldn't put you guys through that, but just sort of seeing where you guys are at with your building re-occupancy and getting a feel for what the climate is like right now. So a little bit about myself is my name is Heather Swale. I'm the operations manager of the Indoor Environmental Quality Group here in the Richmond, BC office. I've been with Pinchin I just had my 9-year anniversary, but I am a new transfer from the Winnipeg office. So if there are any former Prairie people on the line, go Jets go. We're in the middle of playoffs. Maybe this will be our year, maybe, hopefully. But what we're going to be talking about today is what the environmental hazards are when going back to the building. A lot of our clients have asked us, do you just open the door and people can go back in? The answer is no. There's some due diligence we have to do on our part before people can reoccupy. So we're going to talk about 3 major things. The first is how to manage the risk of COVID. We'll talk a little bit about transmission and what you can do if your building is totally unoccupied or if it was just underoccupied. Then we'll talk about the re-occupancy hazards. So the CDC has identified 3 main hazards with people coming back to their buildings. Those 3 hazards are mold, Legionella, and leachate. So we'll talk about all of those. And then lastly, we'll talk about building system startups. So your HVAC, your water, and even some fire and life safety systems. So that's what we're expecting on the docket today. And we'll move right into the session. Okay. Are you guys seeing, Rui, are you guys seeing past my title screen?
We still see the thank you for joining us today screen.
I'm going to reshare everyone. I think maybe when I turn my video on, I have changed that setting. Okay, perfect. Rui, my controls don't seem to be working with the share anymore.
So click on the screen, the presentation screen, and then hit your...
There we go. See, I'm a millennial and still technically challenged. We're learning so much between Zoom and Teams and all those things with COVID. Thanks for that, Rui.
No problem.
So I think you guys can see my title screen now. This is what we just talked about, a little bit about our session goals and what we're going to chat about today, and the 3 main elements of our presentation. So we'll dive right into our first section about managing risk. So one of the things with COVID and risk is there's a few things to think about. The traditional concept of risk is risk equals probability multiplied by the magnitude. So how severe the consequence could be by how likely it is to happen. But one thing this traditional equation doesn't look at is the outrage component, how people perceive the hazard as well. And that's really important, especially when it comes to COVID. What I like to look at from a COVID perspective is risk equals hazard plus outrage. So the hazard is how dangerous something is, and the outrage is how upsetting it is. All of our clients we've been talking to have had employees all across the spectrum. Some people are feeling like COVID is over, they have their first vaccination, they're kind of treating COVID a little less serious than they did before. Maybe they're forgetting to distance, not wearing their masks all the time. Those are people that see a very low, it's not very upsetting to them anymore. And then on the other spectrum, we have people that find COVID extremely upsetting. So people that don't want to go back to work at all until everyone is vaccinated or all of the protocols are in place. All of our clients, you will probably have people in your building all over this spectrum. And really what we want to do with managing outrage or the perceived risk of COVID is to make sure that the outrage is high enough that people are taking the risk seriously, but it's not so high that it's over-regulated. Sometimes when there's a really intense outrage or public perception with something, we over-regulate by lawsuits, insurance claims, expensive equipment and solutions. And really the goal of this is to be in the sweet spot, right in the middle where people are taking COVID seriously still, but we're not going beyond into crisis management and crisis communication management. So COVID transmission, the principal mode of transmission is occurring through close contact with unprotected, infected individuals. It happens when we inhale the droplets that contain the virus, or when the droplets will land on our mucous membrane, so our eyes, nose, mouth. Also, if we're touching infected surfaces and then touching those mucous membranes as well. That's the main route of transmission. And there are two principal processes to determine the amount of virus and of which a person is exposed to. The first one is decreasing the concentration of virus in the air. So I think people are probably very familiar with what you've seen on the news of people being close and you can see how far the respiratory droplets fly. Most of the droplets will settle on the ground just by gravity within about 2 meters. But then there are some really small fine droplets that are aerosols that remain suspended in the air for a longer period of time. Those are the droplets that we want to dilute, we want to change the air, we want to increase the fresh air in the building so we can dilute those and keep the concentration of the aerosols low. We'll talk more about HVAC later in the presentation, but that is one point. And then the second point is the loss of viral viability. So over time, the droplets are going to become less viable with the virus. So just due to environmental factors, time, sunlight, temperature, humidity, those all impact how long the virus will actually, the virus is on and can infect you. So one of the things we're going to touch on is the requirements in BC. If you're not from BC, do not worry, the solutions we're going to talk about really apply everywhere, but I'm just going to touch on some of the WorkSafe BC specific legislation that they are requiring. The first one is that all employers require a COVID-19 safety plan. I hope all of your workplaces have this in place already. If they do not, the WorkSafe BC website has so many good free resources of how to develop this yourself. One of the things that has been talked about over COVID is a lot of buzzwords: unprecedented times, uncharted territory, evolving science, and they're right. This is a global pandemic. We have not lived through something this severe in a very long time, and the science has been changing throughout COVID. When COVID first started, I was in the office, it was very low occupancy, but we weren't required to wear masks. Now we have to wear masks in our office in addition to the physical distancing. So things have really changed over the course of a year. And because of that, WorkSafe BC makes sure that you are monitoring your plan and updating it with these changes as well. So the main components of a safety plan is to assess the risks. That's the first one. So look at where people are working and how close of a proximity they are. So distance them, put barriers in place, and look at any contaminated surfaces. So are you sharing any equipment at the work site? Are there any shared fleet vehicles that people are using? Are there any gathering places like lunchrooms or shared washrooms that people are going to be touching the same surfaces? Assessing the risks of your full building is very important. And then making sure you put in protocols to reduce the risks. So in our office, we came up with a COVID plan to basically separate all of our work areas so everyone can maintain their physical distance. A lot of us, like myself, are still working at home. We've even put up barriers in a lot of public facing areas, for instance, at our reception area, to protect our staff and also our visitors that are coming into the building. And also developing policies, so making sure that your staff, your tenants, your employees know what is expected of them. Placing signage saying if you need to wear a mask, having disinfecting stations everywhere, and communicating that plan is really important. When we talked about outrage on the last slide, people will feel better if there's a good communication plan in place and they feel comfortable with the changes and protocols that the building is putting in place. And then the last step is making sure you're monitoring this plan, because as things are changing, it's really important to keep updating this. So now we'll get into just a touch point on underoccupied versus unoccupied. I think a lot of buildings at the beginning of the pandemic were totally empty. And as we've progressed through this, we've kind of moved to more of a low occupancy, I would say. I have a couple poll questions. Rui, if you wouldn't mind just bringing up the first one. I'd love to just take the temperature of the audience and see what your workplaces are currently at right now. Okay, so the first question we're going to be asking is, what is the current occupancy of your building? Is it unoccupied, no one's in it? Is it underoccupied, where maybe there's just a lot less people in the office, low occupancy? Or have you resumed to the design capacity? Is everyone back, but maybe it's under a different protocol like spread out or something? Or is it unknown? Maybe you haven't been back to the office in a year and you have no idea how it's functioning. If you can please vote, I'd love to know what you guys are all working in right now. So it looks like 90% of you are in under-occupied buildings, and the last 10% are at designed capacity. I think that's really encouraging that people are moving back to their normal work life, but I'm also encouraged that it's sort of a cautious return as well. Okay, I have another poll question I'd like to ask here. Rui, could you put this one up? So I'm wondering where your predominant work location has been during the pandemic. Have most of you guys been working at home? Have you been in the office mostly under safe precautions, or some other scenario? I know our work I've been a mix of home and office, mostly at home, but we've reduced our occupancy so we can have a really small number of staff coming in. I really like that mix. Interesting. So 61% of you are in the office over COVID, and 35% of you have been at home. So I think the home numbers are probably higher than pre-pandemic, but this is actually, of the groups we've presented this to, that's a pretty high ratio that you guys are back in the office. But that's great. I think a lot of you are coming back as we move through the pandemic. So that's great. Those are the poll questions we'll ask for now, Rui, and we'll ask the last one a little bit later. Thank you. So then and now of the typical office, a common question we're getting is, we're all vaccinated now, or hopefully most of us have been able to get their first dose now. When are we going to get back to this photo on the left? Like, when is it going to look like this again? Because at the start of the pandemic, it was really looking like the photo on the right. And despite vaccination rollout, COVID is probably going to be here for a while in the workplace. It's going to affect our full return and how we come back. One of the things that isn't fully clear yet is how workplaces, how schools, how they're going to manage the vaccine rollout. For example, will vaccines be required by employees for students? What about visitors and contractors coming into your building? What about workplace discrimination if some people are vaccinated and some people aren't? And how will you handle voluntary disclosure of health records? It's a really slippery slope when it comes to vaccination. So I think what's really going to happen is we're probably going to be dealing with a hybrid model for a long period of time still. Probably looking like something similar to what's going on the right here. This is what our office is looking like now. We're at a lower number of people in the office than normal. One of the things I thought was really cool is this photo on the left is an architecture firm that's integrating pandemic design into their interior design. So what you can see here is each office space has a sort of a beige strip of carpet. That's where the occupant's chair is supposed to remain, and then a black circle around it. So that's the 2-meter distance that if someone is sitting in their desk chair, you can talk to them safely while maintaining distancing. A lot of you have probably seen like the stickers on the floor and tapes. This is kind of a nice integrated design that is a little less obvious, but still gives you the visual cues. And I'm not sure, it's a little bit difficult to see because they're so clean, but there's some nice barriers behind the monitors as well to protect people. So really interesting how people are thinking about adapting pandemic protocol into their office layout in the future. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the environmental hazards associated with reoccupying your building. So the CDC, as I mentioned, identified 3 top risks. That's mold, Legionella, and leachate from specifically lead and copper. So the first one we're going to talk about is mold. And mold is a little bit near and dear to my heart, I guess you could say, if that's even a thing. Pre-pandemic and even currently, dealing with microbial growth is something our department does a lot of. And one of the concerns is with people not being in buildings all the time is, have you missed something? Is there a small problem that normally would have been identified earlier that's now a really big problem? So what is mold? There's many kingdoms of living matter. If you remember this back in your science days, there's the animal kingdom, there's the plant kingdom, and there's also the fungi kingdom. The fungi kingdom is made up of yeasts, molds, and mushrooms. So how a mold is defined as a mold is because there are microscopic filaments called hyphae. That is that picture sort of in the middle of the screen. They're these long filaments. That's how the mold actually grows. And it reproduces chiefly through spores. So when we're doing mold air sampling, we're measuring the airborne spores in the air. And these photos on the bottom are really what you will might come back to in your office. On the bottom right, we have a water-stained ceiling tile that has been stained so long that there's mold growing at the bottom right corner of it. So things that would have been replaced, maintained, taken care of are kind of escalating into larger issues because people aren't in their buildings like they used to. Even if you've maintained a low occupancy, there aren't as many people around that are going to catch these things unless it's some catastrophic water loss or something like that. So the big concern about mold is how fast mold grows. It takes 12 hours from wetting for the hyphae to begin forming, and the spores start forming within 3 to 10 days. This photo is just 6 days after a water loss. So depending on how big of an area the water impacted, this can be a problem really quickly. The guidelines say between 24 to 48 hours, you have to dry it out or you have to assume that there is mold growth. I know, if you have a water loss on a Friday night and no one's back in the building until Monday, that's already a concern. Not to mention now when we haven't been in our buildings for weeks, months, like almost a year for some people. So there could be some really hidden problems here. So we'll just chat about some common sources of mold. The first two, roof leaks and plumbing leaks, these are extremely common. This happens whenever there's a failure with the roofing or the plumbing system. And the thing to take away here is that large issues are extremely obvious. If you are dripping water from the ceiling, there's an issue. But if it's a slow leak that's going on behind a wall cavity or a ceiling cavity, you might not know there's a big issue and it could be hidden. There's also condensation. So condensation is when water vapor becomes a liquid, air is cooled to its dew point. So very commonly we'll see this around windows, around the windowsills like in these pictures, and even lifestyle mold from like showers or something like that. A lot of facilities, workplaces now might have gyms or a shower station if you're, commuting via bike or something like that. So another area for you to look at during your walkthrough. And then finally, thermal bridging is also quite common. So thermal bridging is also called a cold bridge or a heat bridge. And basically it's when there's a higher heat transfer than the surrounding materials. So as you can see in this case on the ceiling, you can see almost exactly where the studs are on the ceiling. And that's because the studs aren't insulated, so they're creating a bridge that's moving heat out of the building. And when there's a temperature difference between the indoor and outdoor space, it could be warm and humid air that could have a risk of condensation, which if left unchecked, can be a mold problem. Another thing to note is that most mold growth is hidden. About 80% of mold growth is hidden. In this case, in this photo, there were no signs of mold growth at all on the other side of the drywall. The picture, the sort of left-hand side, was covered with a vinyl wallpaper, which was sealing the moisture in and caused a lot of mold growth when we actually opened up and saw in the wall cavity. And the thing is that even though you can't see it, if hidden spores are being amplified, they can still negatively impact the air quality. And mold is a health hazard. It does affect everyone differently. Very minor reactions can be something on a minor allergic spectrum, like irritation of the throat, sneezing, but things can escalate as well. It can cause multi-system inflammatory effects, neurological problems, or even death if it was in certain species of very high levels. In 2003, there were 10,000 mold-related lawsuits in the United States, and some of them kind of have some celebrities, and I will tell you about them because I'm addicted to the tabloids. So in that year, in 2003, Ed McMahon, the host of The Tonight Show, he settled a lawsuit for $7.2 million because his house made him and his wife very ill because of toxic mold, and it killed their dog. So mold is an insurance liability. It can cause health impacts. It's very important to check in your building and resolve problems as soon as you find them. So steps to minimize mold after a prolonged shutdown or a prolonged period of reduced occupancy. The first thing to talk about is managing your relative humidity. Mold can grow on almost anything. It just needs a nutrient source, it needs moisture, and it needs those are the proper conditions for it. So keeping your relative humidity between 40 to 60% is ideal during COVID, also from air quality perspective, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. The next thing is doing your due diligence, inspecting your building for any moisture or water damage. Smell musty odors as well. If you are smelling something that is, I like to call it kind of like a musty, possibly grandma smell. It definitely smells like my grandma's basement because that is very moldy. That's exactly what I think of. And if you do find any issues, address the source of the water first and then follow it with your remedial mold actions. And then also HVAC operation. Make sure you have a maintenance program and you're inspecting it regularly. We'll talk about that more in the upcoming slides as well. Okay, we're going to move on to Legionella now, which is the second environmental hazard identified by the CDC for returning to buildings. Legionellosis are the diseases caused by Legionella bacteria, and there's two main ones that come from that. The first one is Legionnaires' disease, and the second is Pontiac fever. So Legionnaires' disease is the more serious of the diseases. It causes potentially deadly lung infections. Pontiac fever is the more mild infection where it's more flu-like symptoms. The cause of how to get these diseases is inhaling the Legionella bacteria. So basically the bacteria is aerosolized, and if you inhale it, that's how you can get some of these Legionnaire's disease or Pontiac fever. And the main reason people get sick is because the water system is not properly maintained in the building. We'll talk about those in the next couple of slides as well. One thing why this is not like COVID is it's not contagious. COVID, we can pass from person to person. Legionnaire's disease, it sticks with the host. You can't spread it. There's about 6,000 cases a year in the US that the US is reporting, but we do think that number is probably on the low side because some people that have the symptoms of Pontiac fever probably think it's just a flu and it goes away on its own without treatment. But it is very treatable with, if it's caught early with just standard antibiotics, most cases do clear up. However, the fatality rate is about 10 to 15%. So what affects Legionella? There are two really big things to chat about on this is temperature. Temperature is a huge one. So Legionella bacteria, it's in all water. It's in all natural streams and lakes. It's when it's in a man-made system where that bacteria accumulates to really high levels that it's the problem. And having a temperature in the Legionella growth range of like 20 to 49 degrees Celsius, it's ideal growth time for that bacteria. So where we want to keep our systems is anything above 49, the bacteria will start to die off and like rapid death above 70 degrees Celsius. So really the hotter the better for killing Legionella bacteria. Another thing to talk about is biofilm. So biofilm is kind of that sticky, slimy pond scum-like stuff. It's the primary contributor of Legionella outbreaks. Basically, this slime protects the bacteria, so whenever it's disturbed, it releases a huge quantity of this Legionella bacteria, which is associated with a lot of the building outbreaks that we see. Particularly, we see this issue on corroded surfaces, so your domestic hot and cold water systems. So the main concern specifically with COVID is dead legs. So dead legs are the section between, in this case, the sink and the circulation riser where the water is sitting stagnant. So that horizontal piece there. It's a big issue in COVID because we're not using these sinks like we used to be, in this case, a sink. If we had a fully occupied building, maybe a sink is used 200 times a day, depending on how big your office is. But if the occupancy is not there or has been reduced, that water is sitting stagnant in that dead leg. And it's a beautiful breeding ground for Legionella bacteria. So turning on that, if the building has not flushed water regularly, this is a big concern. The second concern with this from the CDC is leaching of metals as well. So while the dead legs foster bacteria growth, that water also sits in the pipe that can leach chemicals and metals that it's sitting in. So if you have an older building with lead solder, that lead could leach into the water as well. So another thing to think about, and also why flushing the water in your building is super important. So the recent questions we're getting with bacteria is, or with Legionella is, do you have it in your building? My building has been vacant or very low occupancy for so long. What do I do now that people are coming back? Do I have to flush the building? Do I have to test it? What are my resources associated with this? The simple answer is that essentially almost all buildings will have Legionella. If your building has been vacant or low occupancy and there has been regular flushing, you're probably going to be in okay shape. If the flushing has not happened regularly, our recommendation would be to start flushing the building and then test your building for Legionella to make sure that you're managing the problem. We don't recommend testing if you haven't flushed yet. There's really no need to test a worst case scenario. We want to test after the building's been flushed to make sure the program you're using is working for your building. And we will talk about testing coming up. The good thing about Legionella is that it is such a well-documented problem. There are tons of resources of how to manage this for free. There are ASHRAE standards, AIHA standards, the Government of Canada standards that will help you with flushing and how to maintain your water in the building. So a couple of the things when you're considering testing before people come back. The first one is that there are specific sampling procedures. For one thing, the supplies, they need to be in specific sterile bottles of a certain size, depending on what you're sampling. It's a 100 milliliter sample for a cooling tower and a 500 milliliter sample for usually any other source. It has to be packed in an insulated cooler, and the timeline is also very important. The lab has to receive your samples within 48 hours of collection. So that doesn't mean you can take the sample, sit on it for a couple days, and then ship it to the lab. You really have to send it out right away if you're not using a local lab to make sure they get it in time. And then it's also very important to make sure you're selecting a lab that has the right type of analysis. The analysis that it must comply with is ISO 17025. Another good one, though, is also the CDC ELITE program is ideal. So ELITE stands for Environmental Legionella Isolation Techniques Evaluation. If you can find a lab that analyzes with that certification as well, that is ideal. And then also just making sure you pick a smart lab that gives you advance notice if they are finding Legionella in your samples. If they have a 2-week turnaround time in labs, make sure they'll contact you ASAP if there is a problem so you can address it right away. Pinchin does have a lab that measures Legionella samples. So if you would like that contact info, I'm happy to provide it to you. So some of the Legionella analytical methods, there's 3 main methods. There's culturing, QPCR, and then DIY test kits. Definitely culturing is the gold standard. What it does is it measures the viable colonies of Legionella. So you can see the Petri dish on the side. That's the Legionella growing, actually. The one downfall with this is that it does take 7 to 10 days to get the results because they are culturing on the Petri dish plates, but it will tell you the viable Legionella, which is so important. The QPCR method is beneficial because you get results very quickly, usually within 4 hours of receipt at the lab. But the downfall of it is that it detects both viable and non-viable Legionella. So what our recommendation would be is if you have not tested your system yet, would be to do the culturing method. And then if you did identify a problem, use the QPCR afterwards to make sure your flushing program, your hygiene program is working effectively. So steps to minimize Legionella before coming back into your building: develop a water management plan if you don't have one already. Those resources I showed on the previous slides have a lot of canned programs that you can implement at your building. Make sure your system is maintained properly, especially the temperature side of things, and flush the system. Flush it and have a flushing implementation program. Also, clean all your decorative features like water fountains, any fountains, hot tubs, spas. A lot of buildings have like gyms in them now, stuff like that. So a shower might not be that odd in an office anymore. Cooling towers are a big one to make sure they're clean and well maintained. And there are water sources that we forget about a lot too. If you have sprinklers, if you have eye wash stations, if you have safety showers, those all use water and need to be clean and well maintained as well. And then sample and test your buildings for Legionella is recommended before reopening your buildings, and then maintaining your water system moving forward. So now we'll get into some of the building systems about safe and unsafe startup. So the biggest question we've had around COVID has been with HVAC and what to do with your HVAC system. How should we change the building operation? What should we be doing? ASHRAE is the leading body that gives us recommendations related to COVID, to HVAC rather, and have included recommendations for COVID. ASHRAE stands for the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. They have released a lot of documents that are also free. Some are paid, some are not paid, but they do on their website, they've listed some of their COVID recommendations, their top recommendations. And those are for reducing the airborne infectious aerosol exposure. So those really fine particles we were talking about earlier. So their core recommendations include ventilation, filtration, and air cleaning. More fresh air, the better, and trying to achieve a MERV 13 or better for your filters. We'll talk about all of these in more detail in the upcoming slides. Air distribution is a big one as well. We want to avoid drafts, which we'll chat about. And your HVAC system operation, maintaining your temperature and relative humidity set points, trying to flush between occupied periods, and making sure 3 air changes or equivalent of clean air supply is kind of the goal according to ASHRAE. And also verify system commissioning, making sure your HVAC is functioning as designed. I know my office in Winnipeg, I had a really nice big office. It was designed for like the corner office person, but they crammed 10 of us into it. So certainly the use did not match the original design that it was made for. And that's quite common of office buildings, schools, really any building. So this is why this photo, this drawing really shows why poor ventilation leads to high infection rates. So this photo on the left, you see the individual with the heavy droplets. They're just falling on the ground in blue due to gravity. And there's a few red aerosol particles in the air. So if you're getting a lot of supply air and exhaust, you're diluting it with the supply and removing it with the exhaust. That's really the goal. On the right-hand side shows what happens when there's no ventilation. Those aerosol particles just build up over time. The longer an infected individual is in the space, the more that is going to accumulate in the room. That's why ventilation is so important. So really the takeaway from this cartoon is to provide as much air, outdoor air as you can. You can demonstrate you're also doing a good job of that by air monitoring, which we'll talk about at the end of this section. So filters, ASHRAE recommends to upgrade to MERV 13 or better. If that's not possible, upgrade to the highest MERV rating that your system can handle. And one thing these photos are illustrating is filter bypass. Not just the MERV rating of your filters, but making sure they're seated properly, they're installed properly is a very big deal with filtering out these aerosol particles. On the photo on the left, you can see there's sort of a space between the white filter and the yellow filter. The air that it's supposed to be filtering is moving right in between that crack, so it's not getting filtered. The photo on the right is sort of a more extreme example where a filter has been damaged, but the air is totally bypassing it then. So your MERV 13 filters or better aren't working very well if you're not installing them properly. So this is a very interesting study about why drafts are so important with COVID aerosols. This is a restaurant. On the upper right-hand side, they have a wall-mounted air conditioning system. The people seated in C1 and C2 were infected individuals. And all of the other people with the red circles at table A and table B became infected with COVID because of this outbreak. So the air conditioner took those aerosol particles and carried them much further than the 2-meter distance. This really was a good study to show how drafts impact the carry of those aerosol particles. And no one in tables F, E, or D got COVID because they weren't in that airstream. Very interesting. So one thing to touch on is how would this apply in your building, in your office, in your school? Well, one of them that I look at a lot is you see these air conditioning units in a lot of boardrooms, the wall-mounted ones. Also, a lot of desk fans. People put fans at their desk or personal fans somewhere in their office space to help control temperature, but really not advisable during COVID because it can carry those aerosol particles. And also look out for other signs of people not being satisfied with their air quality as well. Supply diffusers, we constantly see people putting towels or taping off part of the diffuser because it's very drafty on them. That will have the same effect. So making sure your system is balanced and that it's not causing significant drafts is also very important. So the HVAC best practices for startup: follow the ASHRAE recommendations we talked about. Do your due diligence with inspection, see if there's any leaks, debris, damage, if you see any water or mold, and also obstructions. If there's anything blocking your supply diffusers, your return air exchanges, if the intakes have been damaged or if they're blocked by anything, and making sure your dampers are still operational as well. So one of the things a lot of our clients are moving to is re-occupancy indoor air quality monitoring. When we talked about that outrage piece at the beginning of the presentation, indoor air quality monitoring can reassure your occupants that you are managing the air quality. Before COVID, air quality was the #1 concern for tenants. It was the #1 environmental factor that they saw value in. And I think that's even more important now in a COVID world. So we look at a couple of different things here, and there's a couple of ways to test as well, which I'll chat about. But the benchmarks we look at are measuring carbon dioxide, particulate matter, and relative humidity. So starting with carbon dioxide, we measure carbon dioxide as basically a surrogate for ventilation. We breathe out carbon dioxide when we exhale. So the more occupants, the higher the carbon dioxide will be. But that's diluted when we bring fresh air into the room. So if we have a good ventilation rate, we should have pretty low carbon dioxide numbers. Our general comfort recommendation that we look at as a goal is about 1,200 parts per million. But during COVID, really 800 would be ideal. There was a study done in the Healthy Buildings program at Harvard where about 800 parts per million was associated with 4 to 5 air changes per hour, which would be considered good and ideal during COVID. So one of the things we're doing is we're testing at different phases of building reoccupancy. So when the building is usually 25% occupied, we'll do our air testing and make sure all of the parameters are in the right range. A few more people will come back, maybe it's 50% occupied and we'll test again. And then maybe a third round as well, 75% we'll test again. Basically what that will do is it will ensure your tenants that you're maintaining these parameters, these guidelines, and if there's any adjustments you should make while bringing more people back. So the PM 2.5, this is looking at the filtration. So the filtration will remove the virus from the air. So really less than 16 is what we're looking at to show that the filters are working effectively. One thing we've been getting a lot of questions on is portable air filter devices. Those can absolutely be used. Just make sure you're getting the right size and unit for your space. It also only lowers the aerosols in a single space. So getting one for a building will not fix your whole building. It might fix the one office it's in, but not the other areas. So 6 air changes an hour is ideal for the portable filtration devices. And then finally, looking at relative humidity. So relative humidity, it doesn't remove COVID, but it has 2 primary importances here. The first is that having your humidity between 40 to 60%, that's the desired range for healthy lungs. That's the best range for us to fight respiratory infections. And the second is the amount of time the virus is suspended in the air. So really dry air, those aerosol particles will remain suspended for a longer time. So from the COVID perspective, 40 to 60% is sort of the ideal range for relative humidity. So there's 2 testings we are doing. I described the phase occupancy, that's usually 25, 50%, and 75. That is sort of our traditional testing where we will send a technician out at those different phases and do testing over a period of time. But a newer option that's coming out is active indoor air quality, which I think is really exciting, especially as people are coming back into the building. What this is the installation of permanent sensors in the building. So your air quality is constantly being measured. This is good because the data is on the cloud. You don't need someone to come back. And also it's a permanent building fix that will help you post-COVID. You can always get your results live, up to date, see if there's any problems. You'll get alerts if anything's going on outside of your desired ranges. It's a really helpful tool that I think could be a good selling feature for building owners. A lot of tenants might be questioning right now if they need the space, the amount of space they're in now. And this is showing that you're doing your environmental due diligence and also proving that you are sort of in a elite echelon of building owners or managers or maintenance, that you're taking this seriously. And this is a great feature for your building to have. So we did touch on Legionella, but just to look at some of the other water and plumbing systems to look at, minimize the Legionella risks that we talked about earlier, flush your system, inspect your water systems, do your due diligence, but a couple of other things that are non-COVID related, but just kind of return to your building related is cleaning, disinfecting your screens and aerators, test your water pressure, make sure your P-traps are filled with water, inspect any visible pipes you can see for corrosion. Certainly leaky pipes are the cause of a lot of moisture, water damage, potentially mold issues. And also don't forget about your sump pump and making sure that alarm is still working. Fire and life safety systems, absolutely making sure everything is in working order before coming back. Make sure your fire alarm is working, all of your life safety systems, including your fire suppression system. So any water-based system, inspect the valves, the gauges, the sprinkler system and heads, your fire department connection, and make sure they can get in and connect to your building, and your emergency water shutdown as well. If you have a specialized suppression system, make sure you're following the manufacturer recommendations still. And one common thing that I've seen people forget coming back into their buildings is inspecting extinguishers and their hose cabinets. Make sure that those are still maintained and inspected on their regular basis, and that there's nothing missing from your hose cabinet. Like there's usually a glass breaker there. Make sure that's still present. And access and egress, this is another thing people are forgetting about, is I found a lot of offices have become sort of storage rooms while a lot of people are working at home. Make sure that all of your pathways and doorways are unobstructed. If you have a pile of Amazon boxes to the ceiling, it's time to recycle those so people can get in and out of your building. Make sure the fire doors are closed and that the latch is operational, that they're working, that the hydrants aren't blocked, that the fire department lanes are unblocked and accessible, and making sure all of your exit lights are illuminated as well, making sure none of your lights have burnt out or anything like that. And then a couple of additional inspections. Electrical, absolutely, inspecting your panels, any visible feeder cables or connections. Your emergency lighting would be a huge one to verify that it's still working. Looking at any equipment like boilers, air compressors, elevators and escalators are getting forgotten about a lot too. Make sure those are working and operational. And pest management, lastly, because we haven't been in our buildings regularly, we've had a ton of requests for pest management programs and pest management remediation. They've made really nice homes in our buildings with lots of droppings, urine stains, nesting. Make sure you look for all of that during your inspection. Make sure your traps are still in place or replace them if they're full. That's another big one to look for. Your employees might want to go back home if they come into their office and they see a rat scurrying across the floor. So a good thing to look for. So a large portion of my presentation was based on the CDC guidance for reopening buildings after prolonged shutdown and reduced operation. This is the link if you guys would like this resource on the screen. Basically, the hit home point here was that whether your building had 0 people in it or whether it had 5 people in it or a 10%, a small number, is there's hazards whether it was vacant or not fully occupied. So make sure you do your due diligence and inspect your building and make the recommendations we've chatted about here so that people feel safe coming back. They're not outraged. We're in that sweet spot of where they're feeling aware of the issue, but they're not overly concerned about it. Manage your risks. And building maintenance. Let's do the last poll question now if we can, Rui. I'm very interested to see how you guys think about this one. Post-pandemic, where is your preferred work location? Have you settled in at home and you never want to come back to the office? Or are you missing the people aspect of things? You can't wait to get back to the office. Or maybe it's other and you would rather work in an alternate location. I'm really curious about what you guys have thought about this. We're polling our own staff to see their thoughts, and I can't wait to see what you guys think as well. Personally, I've settled in at home, but I do miss my coworkers. Oh, it was a pretty interesting split here. So 59% do want to get back to the office, but 33% want to stay home. That's a very interesting split. Yeah, I think I agree with that option as well. So just to wrap up, to talk about some building maintenance, there's always going to be liability if you do not address adverse conditions in the building. Preventative maintenance is required no matter what. Maybe your preventative maintenance programs aren't as robust as before the pandemic. Maybe they're not 100%, but you still need to be doing your inspections and maintaining your building. Your preventative maintenance is required. Every province has a general duty clause. For BC, the general duty clause says, despite the absence of a specific requirement, all work must be carried out without undue risk of injury or occupational disease to any person. Everyone has a right to work in a safe environment, is what this says. So not maintaining your water systems and causing a Legionella outbreak, not addressing a mold concern in someone getting sick, you could be liable for this. So make sure you do maintain your buildings appropriately. This is my contact information. We have a few minutes to take questions now, so we'll open up the chat and see if there's anything we missed. But this is my email. Please feel free to email me after this. I would be happy to connect in person. Actually not in person, it's COVID, but like this, virtually or via email or on the phone. We can set something up and chat about any further questions you guys may have. Also, after we chat about these questions, there is a brief survey of how you liked this session. You can scan the QR code here. If you would like to participate, I would love the feedback. We are rolling out this presentation in a few other provinces and a few possibly specific industries, so your feedback would be much appreciated. Thanks very much, guys. Okay, we'll open up the chat and see if there are any questions. Okay. Rui, would you?
There's no questions in the Q&A right now.
Okay.
I didn't see any in the chat.
Well, I'll take that I was a very thorough presenter, that you guys loved it. You learned a lot. Also, no worries though, if I know I'm a chatty Cathy now, but I sometimes get shy asking questions in front of a group. Again, please feel free to email me if you have any further questions. If you'd like a copy of this presentation, I would love to connect. So with that, I will leave you all. Thanks everyone for participating. I really appreciate it. And have a good rest of your Thursday. Bye everyone.